So Model Creator for GameMaker is nice, but if you use it a lot, you'll quickly find that it has more than a couple of shortcomings, namely that it becomes really, really slow after a few thousand triangles are added. And if you're like most people, you'll probably start to think about using other 3D modeling programs to make your models for your 3D games in GameMaker. For example, Blender, 3ds Max, Maya, I can't remember any others off the top of my head. But that gives us a problem, which is that GameMaker can't natively import any FBX or DAE or OBJ files on its own. Fortunately, there's a solution to that, and that solution is to write your own importer. Specifically, if you guessed by looking at the title of this video, I'm going to be taking care of an OBJ importer today in this video. Now, I can close out of this. There are plenty... No, I don't really want to say. There are plenty of scripts out there on the internet that will help you import an OBJ model, and they should be relatively plug and play. But since I'm a person who believes in knowing what your code is doing before just taking it from the internet and running it, I make that sound like a really bad idea, don't I? But since I believe in knowing what your code is doing before taking it from the internet and running it... Okay, I got interrupted by a dog. Let me try that again. So, since I'm a person who believes in knowing what your code is doing before you take it from the internet and just running it, I'm going to be going through step-by-step how to make your own OBJ model importer in this video. Now, it's going to, if you watch the previous video I made on loading GameMaker models in GameMaker Studio 2, this is going to be similar. I'm going to call the script OBJ. This will work in GameMaker Studio 1 or 2, or theoretically versions before that if you're still using GameMaker 7 or 8 or something like that. I really hope nobody is still using GameMaker 7. Anyway, what it's going to take as parameters is a name of the file to open up. So I'm going to say var file name equals argument 0. I should mention, if you are using GameMaker 7 or 8 or something like that to follow this video, you will have to make a couple adjustments before this code will compile. For example, this, when you're declaring your local variables. But this is not a video on compatibility between GameMaker versions. Let me increase this font size a little bit. Okay, so before I continue, I should probably talk about what is in an OBJ file a little bit. So, there we go. You can tell I visit this page a lot because of how quickly it came up on the suggested links in Google Chrome. But if you open it up in Notepad, for example, I'm going to take this, where is it? Mary.obj. You'll see it contains a few things. There's some comment lines, which you can see. They start with the pound sign. A couple commands, which I will be disregarding in this video because they're not really necessary. V with a couple weird things after it. Further down, if I can grab the scroll bar, there will be VT with a couple weird things after it. Further down, VN. Further down, F. The point is this is plain text, and we can treat it as plain text as long as you know what information is stored in it. Specifically, let me minimize this. V simply stands for a vertex. VT stands for a texture coordinate. VN stands for a normal vector. VP I'm not going to worry about today because unless you're doing something really complicated in Blender, you'll probably won't see it. And F stands for face, which puts together a vertex, a texture, and a normal. Or it puts together vertices anyway, optionally textures or normals. There are a few other things you might find in an OBJ. You might find references to material library files, which I'm not going to worry about today. I might make a future video on those. But anyway, God, this is the second time I'm trying to record this video and it's already a mess. Anyway, we're going to say file, text, open, read, file name. Because, as I said, these are plain text files and you can treat them as such. Now, if you're familiar with the GameMaker model file format, you'll know that there are simply lists of vertices, textures, normals, and colors squished together into one data point. And as I just pointed out inside I don't know why I closed that. Here it is. Inside the OBJ model files, they're not quite like that. So the first thing that we're going to do is read out the list of vertices that you'll find. So I will create 3 DS lists. Var vertex x equals DS list create. And the same for Y and Z. And then I will create 3 more DS lists. And this one will take the normals points x, y, and z, normal vectors. And then 2 more DS lists. I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. X text, Y text, and you don't need a Z texture because that doesn't make any sense to have a Z texture coordinate in a 2-dimensional plane. And let me see. I'm actually going to maximize this so that I can get a little bit more space in the code window. What can I do to give myself more space? I can minimize the room and compile windows too. That's better. Now, as I was saying, we need to root out the information that you'll find in here. So we'll create a while loop. And you can say while not, or not if you prefer, literally, file, text, end of file, obj file. Var line equals file, text, read, string, obj file. And because you always want to do a read line after you read a string, file, text, read, read line, like that. And this will simply loop through every line in the text file. And what we need to do now is we need to look at the first character, or the first word really, not the first character. So between the beginning of the line and the first space in each line. Now if you were using another language, there would probably be a built-in way to split a string around the space character, but unfortunately, as of my recording this in July of 2018, GameMaker is not a language that supports a split method. So we'll just do it manually and say var terms, and terms is going to be an array, and it's going to be of size string, count, line, space character, and we'll just initialize that to an empty string. Is that okay? Okay, that's that will compile. And then I should mention, if you already know how to split a string, or if you have written a script to do it yourself in GameMaker, you can skip a couple of seconds ahead into this video. I'll throw a timestamp on screen right now to show where you can skip to. But if you don't have something like that, don't worry, it's not too difficult. It should only take a few minutes. For I equals 0, I is less than string, or actually we have to say I is equal to 1, because GameMaker strings start indexing at 1 for whatever inane reason. I is less than or equal to string length I++. Again, if you're using GameMaker 7 or 8, you'd have to format this for loop a little bit differently, but if you're still watching this video, I trust that you are aware of those differences. Now, if string char or char at line I is equal to, no, that's plus equals, is equal to an empty character, an empty space rather, we could say terms index equals an empty string. An index is a variable that I forgot to initialize, that I should initialize, because it's simply going to track the index of the array that we are currently writing to. And here, before we initialize the index in the array to an empty string, we need to say index plus plus, or index plus equals 1, or index equals index plus 1, or whichever you prefer. And while I'm at it, we should also initialize terms of 0 to an empty string. Oops, empty string, there we go. This string split should work without that, but I just want to be absolutely safe. Now else, if you are not looking at a space character, we can simply say terms index equals terms of index plus string char at line and I. And this is going to simply look through each character in the line. If it hits a space, go to the next index in the terms array. If it doesn't hit a space, then save the contents of the term. All right, so now that we have this array populated, we can switch it. Switch, whoops, terms, thank you, of 0. And I look at my notes on the other screen here. Depending on what the first term is, the first word in the line, the first collection of characters, you'll do a few different things. If it's a V, you will say ds list add vertex x real terms of 1, and you'll do the same thing for terms of 2 and terms of 3 for vertex y and vertex z, because I think I explained this at the beginning of the video, but if I didn't, these 3 values here, if you weren't able to guess already, are the x, y, and z positions of the vertex with a little bit of floating point weirdness. Oh, I love floating point weirdness. It makes everything so much more difficult than it has to be. All right, that's irrelevant. If your first term is case of VT, you will do the same thing, but with the texture coordinates. Vertex x-tex and y-tex. Because, as you can probably guess, if I were to scroll down to VT, these are texture coordinates that follow the VT on the XY plane of the texture that you're using, or the UV coordinates, if you will, if you want to be correct about things. If if your first term is a VN, you will add, I'm sure you can figure out where this is going, you'll add the next three terms rather of the array to the vertex normal ds list. And if your first term is an F, that's a face. Again, I think I mentioned this, but if I scroll all the way down to the bottom of this file here, you have 3 points. You may have more than 3 points depending on the contents of your 3D model in Blender or 3ds Max or whatever you happen to be using. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to be worrying primarily about faces with 3 points in them, so triangles. If you're using Blender, you can select all faces and hit Ctrl-T to convert them to triangles, and I believe there would be similar methods in other 3D modeling software. Anyway, I was in the middle of explaining what this is, wasn't I? This is the first triangle, the first vertex rather, the first texture coordinate, and the first normal, the second vertex point, the second texture coordinate point, and the second normal, and the third vertex. I cannot speak today, can I? The third vertex, the third texture point, and the third normal. So if you didn't understand a word of what I said, that's fine. This is just going to point to the index in the list, in the DS list that we just created here when we read them out of the text file. We're going to, if I can go back to the notepad file here, we're going to have to split each of these terms around instead of the space character, the slash character. And we're going to have to do it for all 3 of these terms here. So I'm going to create a for loop for var, what is it? Let's call it n equals 0, n is less than 3, n plus plus. Now I'm going to do what you should really never do in computer programming and copy and paste. And that's going to be the string splits code that I wrote a few minutes ago. Instead of terms, I'm going to call it data, because the terms variable is already in use and I don't want to overwrite anything accidentally. Instead of, okay, so the I variable loop counter thing is okay here because we are not using that already, because the outer loop is n. And instead of splitting line, I will say term s with an s of I. Every time I see the line, let me see, are there any other instances of line? in here. There are not. Also, this needs to be n equals 1, n is less than 4. Or less than or equal to 3, that works too. Now, we're almost to the point where we can run the game and see how it looks in-game, I promise. But, once you're done with this for loop, we need to say var xx, because I can't just say x because that's a built-in variable, equals ds list find value of vertex x and real data of 0. Is that it? Okay, good, that will compile. And because, for whatever reason, like GameMaker's strings, the OBJ file format starts counting at vertices at 1 instead of at 0. So what computer scientists would call the 0th vertex is going to be the first vertex. We're going to have to subtract 1 here. I made a big deal about that, but it's not a big deal. Alright, so we can copy and paste the same for... not 1 and 2 there, but for YY and ZZ right here. Oops. Vertex Y and vertex Z. Xtext is Xtext with an E is going to be ds list find value vertex Xtext real data of 1. There we go. Minus 1. You can copy that for Y as well. So the last piece of information, var and y, not ny, and x equals ds list find value vertex and x. I did it again. Real data of 2 this time, minus 1. Let's copy this for n, y, and z, the normal y and z components. And that should do it. Now all we have to do is go into the game world object, which is where I created the vertex format. I've been informed that vertex format add text chord with a second t is a deprecated function. And if I just delete the second t in text chord, that will be GameMaker will stop complaining at me. So thank you to whoever informed me of that in the comments a few days ago. Anyway, the order that I have to add them, because this is the order that I created the vertex format, is going to be position, normal, color, and texture coordinates. So if I come back here, vertex, position, 3D, I'm going to need to actually create a vertex buffer. And that's going to look like... You can use a D3D model if you're using GameMaker 7 or 8 or Studio One or something like that, some earlier version of GameMaker, but I'm going to be using vertex buffers here. Again, if you're still watching this, I have to assume that you are aware of how D3D models work if you're using those, and you will be able to follow along. But I'm just going to say vertex buffer create, vertex create buffer. I do that every time, and vertex begin. You can use whatever vertex format you want here, as long as it's got the required information. So vertex position 3D of model XX, YY, and ZZ. Vertex normal model NX, NY, and Z. Vertex color, which in my case is just going to be model C white 1, because in most cases, as I think I mentioned earlier, the OBJ file format does not support colored vertices on its own. If you want that, you have to use the material file format, which I may make a video on in the future. But for now, I am going to assume that people just want to get the models loaded instead of looking pretty. That's a horrible way of putting it. But moving on, vertex, text, chord, model, second close parentheses there. Model, xtext, ytext. And there we have it. After we are done with this while loop, after we've read all the information out of it, I can come down here, vertex, end, model, destroy the data structures, ds list, destroy, vertex X, Y, Z, normal X, normal Y, normal Z, X text, Y text. Let me just do this. Y text, there we go. We can close the file. File text, close obj file, and return the model. And we are done here. I just need to go and actually instantiate one of these things before I go and run the game now. So I'll say, instead of doing one of these two, how about I will say var Mary equals instance create depth. Did I spell that right? I did. 500 depth game object. If you have not been following this mini tutorial series on GameMaker Studio 2 3D, your code for instantiating an object, a model, might look a little bit different. But I'm just gonna say Mary dot model equals load obj. Mary.obj, and I need to add that as an included file because I have not done that yet. And where are they? I believe it's in here. One piece. Mary.obj. And now hopefully when I run the game this will do what it's supposed to, and if it didn't, I've wasted 32 minutes of my time and I'll have to do this over again. And it crashes. Variable index out of range. Excellent. Which line was that? Line 17. No, that was the other one. Line 54. Oh, you know what? I'm stupid. This has to be terms of n instead of terms of I. Okay, crisis averted. Let's see. Terms of I. There we go. Okay, now this should work. Alright. I will hopefully have an annotation on the screen. That's also not good. I did a practice version of this before I started recording, and that worked, and I was following that. And, let's see, which line was that? Line 66. Wait a minute. This has to be split around the slash character, and not the space character. Okay. Again, crisis averted. Let us run the game. Alright, so when I run the game, I have the Going Merry, it's sideways, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. The flag is Z fighting with the floor, and that looks really bad. Alright, so if you go into Blender, the reason for the being sideways and upside down and whatever is that if you look at the export settings for wavefront object, I'm going to call it Mary2.obj. If you look down here on the sides, and I assume that other 3D modeling software have similar options, up should be Z positive up, or in GameMaker Studio 2 that gets a little bit messier because the camera can be upside down if you did what I did to set it up. But the point is, I'm just going to leave it at Z. I'm going to make it Z negative right now. You can make it Z positive if you want. I'm going to leave it at negative X forward and import here Mary2, export rather, Mary2. And I'm going to go back into included files, insert this, and load object Mary2. And now we have the correct, it's looking correct. Basically, it's sinking through the floor a little bit, and to do that you can simply add a little bit to the Z component, the Z Mary.z equals, say, negative 32, I think I want, because again, my world is upside down. That sounds like a very One Piece thing. And I'm just going to make sure that game object has a Z. It does not. I'm going to say initialize Z to 0 in the create event, and add a Z component to the transformation matrix. Alright, now if I load Mary.object, if you don't want to have to go into Blender every time and run the and change the export settings, because for whatever reason I don't think there's a way to actually permanently set your export settings for OBJ, you could go into load object and do a little swap operation. Var t equals yy equals zz, and zz equals t. You could swap the y and the z positions for every vertex, and I believe this will be upside down. Again, because of the way that I configured my my 3D camera. Yep, that's an upside down Going Merry. But you get the point. There's a number of ways that you could address this. You could mess with the transformation matrix again. You could say game object make... stop middle clicking. You could say game object z scale is -1. Something of that nature. What will this look like? Will this do what I want it to do? Or will this make it below the ground? Oh, nope, this made it what I wanted to do. This did what I wanted to do, rather. It's not lit, it's not textured because I didn't texture it before going and recording this video. And maybe I should have, but that's a video for another day, or I don't know. Lighting probably is a video for another day. That's probably what I'm going to cover next in Game Maker Studio 2. It's a little different than lighting in Game Maker Studio 1 and previous versions, but we'll get there when we get there. For now, this has been, good lord, 45 minutes of me bumbling around and not getting done things that I thought I was getting done. So I'm going to end it off here. For now, I hope everyone who's still watching now has an understanding of how OBJ models work and how to use them in Game Maker. And I hope that that makes creating your 3D games quite a bit easier because, again, Model Creator for Game Maker does leave some things to be desired. My name is Dragonite. I shall be doing more of these, hopefully less infrequently than I've been doing, and I will